Let's take you to West Palm Beach in Florida now, where the state attorney's office is expected to address the charges against Patriots owner Robert Kraft. Let's listen in.
On Friday, February 22nd, the Jupiter Police Department gave us case filing packets stemming from their prostitution sting. After review by our intake prosecutors, we are charging 25 individuals with soliciting another to commit prostitution, pursuant to sections 796.07, 2F, and 5A1 of the Florida statutes. This charge is a first-degree misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail, a mandatory $5,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and a class on the dangers of prostitution and human trafficking. We also expect to receive filing packets for the 2 women who have been arrested by the Jupiter Police Department for, among other things, deriving support from the proceeds of prostitution, which is a second-degree felony. All defendants are presumed innocent at this point. The charges begin the court process with local defendants being mailed a summons to appear in court. Out-of-county defendants will have a capias issued, which is essentially a low-level warrant, and will have to either surrender or have an attorney contact law enforcement to satisfy the warrant. The clerk's office will publicly release court dates for those receiving a summons, and the names of all the defendants will be released. And actually, they have been released already. The names of all defendants already have been released by the Jupiter Police Department. I'd like to thank the men and women of the Jupiter Police Department for their professionalism and diligence in investigating these cases. It's our ongoing partnership with local law enforcement that helps keep our community safe. You can tell a lot about our community by the way it treats its most vulnerable individuals, and that includes victims of human trafficking, which is modern-day slavery. Human trafficking is the business of stealing someone's freedom for profit, including, it can happen anywhere, including in the peaceful community of Jupiter, Florida. In 2017, our office joined with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and the FBI to help start a human trafficking task force. We are pleased with our progress, but we realize there's a lot more to do. These cases aren't about any one defendant or any group of defendants. The larger picture, which we must all confront, is the cold reality that many prostitutes in cases like this are themselves victims, often lured into this country with promises of a better life, only to be forced to live and work in a sweatshop or a brothel, performing sex acts for strangers. Human trafficking is built on force, fraud, or coercion. It is evil in our midst. It is also fueled by the demand side, demands from otherwise law-abiding citizens who are not aware or don't want to be aware about those being exploited. Human trafficking often occurs in plain sight, which is why I'm hopeful that these cases will encourage people to say something if they see something, and for victims of this unreported crime to gain the courage to let their voices be heard. With that, I'd like to take any questions you may have.
And again, please identify yourself if you would.
Yes. No, if they are local residents, meaning if they live in Palm Beach County, they will receive a summons in the mail. It's like a ticket, a notice to appear in court. And that court date can be found through the clerk's office. If they are from out of the county, then they're subject to a capias, which is in effect a low-level warrant. And that one, they would either have to surrender to the authorities, or they could have an attorney reach out and satisfy the warrant.
They will not be required to be here in person.
There is no requirement.
Ted Scout from CPS4 in Miami. Is there any kind of evidence or anything to say that any of these people, any of the 25 people arrested, knew that this was a human trafficking situation?
Well, the matters are still being investigated, and I don't want to get too much into the details of the case because this is a pending matter. But I can say this, that so far there have been no charges of human trafficking in any of these cases, but that could change in the future depending on what the investigators find.
Charles, CBS Charles.
Some of these investigations are months long. They last a while. I know one of these cases was close to a year. We're monitoring these situations. We know we want to get this right in terms of charging everyone involved. But at the same time, you have these women who are victims, held against their will, doing this for months as we're monitoring the situation. So how do you kind of find the compromise between monitoring and making sure you're getting everything right in terms of what you want to charge, but also knowing that these women are suffering another day and another month?
Right. Those are questions for the investigators, the police. The Jupiter Police engaged in a multi-month investigation, and then they turned over the filing packets to our office for prosecution. I think the question you have would be more geared towards the investigators, but they're very professional, and I think they did an outstanding job. So, it's always a balance, as you say, between letting the conduct continue to gain enough evidence to file charges and stepping in and stopping it. But that is really a question for the investigators.
Harry Spencer from Associated Press. First, two questions. Where are the women who were working in or active in the brothels? And also, do you think state law is sufficient right now to deal with this situation?
I was a state senator when we tightened the laws against human trafficking. Florida law is very strong against human trafficking. It is a first-degree felony for most cases of adult human trafficking. When it comes to child human trafficking, it is a life felony. And if there's force involved, some violence involved, then an adult human trafficking would become a potential life felony. So our punishments are severe, but there's a high burden of proof. You need to reach that burden of proof, and that's always the question in these cases, which is why these investigations can take some time. But one thing will mention about Florida law is that Florida law is also very progressive. If victims of human trafficking will speak up, they are eligible to have their records expunged, including arrests for prostitution. But they need to speak up. At the federal level, human trafficking victims are eligible for a T visa, which is a visa that can allow them to stay in the country, and it's only reserved for victims of human trafficking. So the key is to get the victims to speak up.
Where are the women now?
The women now, I know that the investigators have been talking with them, and you'd have to go get details from those agencies such as Jupiter Police Department.
Hey, Harry from NBC News. Florida has a new law that protects victims of crime from having their information revealed. Is there any way that the clients, the Johns here, are considered victims?
No. Marcy's law does not protect defendants. Marcy's law protects victims of crime.
Danielle Watt from CBS 12. These documents you just handed out will put Robert Kraft in the parlor on the morning of the AFC Championship game. Is that correct? He was in Jupiter, Florida that morning?
Well, the documents speak for themselves. What we handed out were the capias themselves, and I know that we don't always give out those documents, but because the Jupiter Police Department identified the names in advance, and you all had the names for some time, we decided to, in the interest of transparency, to let you have those documents, but they speak for themselves.
His influence and money and power and connections. Is there any reason to believe that Robert Kraft will be treated any differently than these other 24 men?
And I can assure you that our office treats everyone the same. Whether you have a lot of money or you are indigent, we treat all defendants the same, and no one gets any special justice in Palm Beach County.
Charles, CBS 12 News, do you expect more arrests to come from other similar businesses within Palm Beach County?
Well, it's hard to say because the investigators are the Jupiter Police, and then you have the Martin County Sheriff's Department, you have Vero Beach. This is a multi-county effort, and so it's hard to say if there are more arrests based on their investigations. But I was asked earlier today about rumors about bigger fish, and I said that would be news to me. And I also added that, it's hard for me to talk about rumors, especially false ones.
Robert Kraft was charged by the Jupiter Police with counts in this arrest affidavit, probable cause affidavit. Are you charged with 2 counts, or is it all the individual ones?
No, there are two cases there. There are 2 counts. Correct.
With your office decided to go from a second-degree misdemeanor to a first-degree misdemeanor, what was it about the fact that you decided to up it to what is the most that you can do in this case?
Well, all the cases are being charged as first-degree misdemeanors under the tougher Florida statute, and one reason why that decision was made was because that statute has a mandatory 100 hours of community service, a mandatory $5,000 fine, and a mandatory class on the dangers of prostitution and human trafficking, not to mention a potential for an increased jail sentence from 60 days to a year.
Robert Kraft owns multiple homes here and up in Massachusetts and California. Would he be given a habeas or a summons? How would you deal with it?
There was a question whether or not Mr. Kraft lived here in Palm Beach County, and I believe we decided it was a summons, so he does have a residence here, so he'd be receiving a summons.
Will he be receiving a mugshot?
Oh, the question is mugshot. When you get a summons in the mail, generally you do not get a mugshot. Now, remember, that's up to the police department. It's not up to us. It's up to the local law enforcement agency.
Has he already been sent that summons?
Has he already been sent that summons?
His attorney has provided the summons.
His attorney has been provided the summons.
The other agencies made a really big deal about putting their mugshots and their driver's license out, pictures out. You guys are handling that a little bit differently here. Do you feel like, are you happy with the way it's being handled?
I think that law enforcement has done an excellent job. They've been very professional and very thorough. And also, they've helped steer the conversation away from any one particular defendant, from any group of defendants, towards the evil of human trafficking. It's about time the country has a real conversation about human trafficking, which is modern-day slavery in our midst. This is not about lonely old men or victimless crimes. This is about enabling a network of criminals to traffic women into our country for forced labor and sex.
How did you come up with these 25 people charged? Aren't there a lot more passing through the trial?
Well, those are the ones charged by the Jupiter Police Department. My jurisdiction is only for Palm Beach County. And by the way, when I talk about human trafficking, I'm talking about the general subject of human trafficking, the larger picture. There is no allegation that any of the defendants were involved with human trafficking. They are not being charged as such. But instead of talking about a particular defendant, I'd like to make the conversation broader, because this country needs to have a reality check on what's going on out there when it comes to forced labor and forced sexual conduct.
When did you first hear about the investigation?
Well, our prosecutors have been involved in this for some time. It's hard to pinpoint when. I've been aware of it for a while.
And what did you think when you first heard that this was happening, in your county?
I've been involved in fighting human trafficking for a while, so nothing surprises me. I give a lot of speeches on it. I'm on the Attorney General's statewide task force for human trafficking. So when this came across my desk, I was not surprised. I'm not surprised about the defendants. The defendants in these matters come from every socioeconomic group. And it's just a reality of the times we live in.
What do you think needs to be done on the supply side of this business in order to stop the problem of human trafficking?
It's a good question. What should be done on the supply side to stop human trafficking? Well, the laws are in place, but I think we need to do better about encouraging victims to speak up, because victims don't know that there are services available to them. They don't know that they could get their criminal records expunged or obtain a special visa to remain in this country. So if we would treat victims in this matter as victims and not as criminals, I think that you would gain the trust of more individuals to speak up on these matters. Because right now, a lot of them come from countries where the police are not their friends. And so they need to know that we're here to help them and treat them as the victims that they are. Terry?
Palm Beach County has a lot of similar enterprise-type businesses
Yeah.
have for years. I know I reported on it as long ago as 15 years ago, but yet they seem to operate almost like in plain sight. What are you doing as state attorney? You say you're focusing on trafficking. But are you telling the police departments, hey, in your jurisdiction, you need to look at these places and set up soon?
Our human trafficking task force works with law enforcement to root out the human trafficking, whether at the storefront or on the internet. A lot of it occurs on the internet. Facebook is a very popular site used by human traffickers to recruit and groom potential victims. So we're working on them on a daily basis. But, there's a high burden of proof. We prosecutors can only file cases that reach the level of a burden of proof that we can obtain beyond a reasonable doubt. And so these cases are long in the making, but we hope that sometimes some of them can make a big enough splash to send a message to the rest of the country.
Can you talk about what federal agencies you've been working with?
Our human trafficking task force works with the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security.
So far, are the victims in this case cooperating?
The victim, well, that's up to investigators. They're working with victims on it. I can't say much on the status of that.
Hey, David, what's the threshold of evidence needed to charge in these cases, specifically the Robert Kraft situation?
Police can charge based on probable cause. Is it more probable than not that a crime has occurred? Our standard is higher. For prosecutors to charge, we have to have a good faith belief that we can get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a higher burden, and it's why sometimes you will see that police will charge in some cases, and then we will decide not to file charges. And that's why we're having this press conference, because we've made the decision that enough evidence exists to file charges in all 25 of these cases.
So, David,
Let me get you next. I'll get you next.
Yeah. All walks of life. What would you say about speculation that someone like Kraft was targeted as a result of his celebrity or his fame or his fortune?
Yeah, I don't understand how someone could be targeted. You look at all the defendants in this matter, they come from all walks of life. There's rich, poor, there's young and old. So I don't believe anyone was targeted for whom they are. Yes, sir. Over here.
David, Dennis on CBS. 2 parts. If the women are considered victims, does the video evidence affect the usage of the prosecutor's tool? Does the video of the victim affect your use of that in the proceedings?
It shouldn't. The individuals involved, we're working with them, and I can't speak more about it as far as the victims to gain more information, but it should not affect our ability to use video ultimately if we need to in court.
What's the most important thing you need right now to meet that high burden of proof that you mentioned?
Well, the video evidence is always very powerful in a court of law. You also have, the testimony of some of the victims. I know that in many cases like this, there are language barriers and there are interpreters needed, and there's also a trust factor that must be gained. So we're working on all those things.
Can you clarify about those evidence and how they got here?
How about this? Let's say Karen, then I'll take you. I'll get you next. Yes, sir.
Is there any possibility that those who have been charged can somehow plead this away to a lesser charge?
Well, there are diversion programs available. There are classes available. So just because the mandatory penalty is up to a year in jail doesn't mean someone's going to get that. If it goes to trial, it's up to a judge, and you look at the person's background. First-time offenders are very unlikely to get significant jail time. So, there are, depending on the plea, depending on the background, depending on the conduct, these are all considerations that come into play.
But your office is open to a plea of a lesser charge by those who've been charged.
Well, we don't talk about the status. That goes into too much detail that I can talk about this time. Yes, sir.
If you can you talk a little bit about the women? How did they get here? Bring us their story of how they got from wherever they were to where they were.
Yeah, that would be for the Jupiter Police Department. I say in cases like this, and I talk about it in generalities because I can't speak to the specific evidence. I can't talk about where they came from or how we broke this case, because that could jeopardize any potential prosecutions. So let's just say that in cases like this, it is not uncommon for women to be lured into this country under false pretenses with the promise of a better life, a high-paying job, only to be stuck in squalor in a brothel or a sweatshop where they're forced to perform labor or sex acts for money.
Can you clarify how this process works for Robert Kraft? You said you determined he is a resident of Palm Beach County. You're issuing him a summons. Does that mean he has to appear in court, or can he send an attorney to appear in court?
Yes, so if it's a summons, so he does not have to make a public court appearance.
So he can send an attorney to appear?
Correct.
And to clarify, does he face 1 or 2 charges?
2 charges.
2 charges.
Yes, sir.
How important is the cooperation and testimony from the women involved relative to this case?
How important is the cooperation?
The cooperation and the testimony from the women involved.
Well, if it goes to trial, their testimony obviously could be helpful, but if there's video evidence, that also is very powerful evidence. But I don't want to talk specifically to the evidence, but in general, video, eyewitness testimony are all important for any trial.
Palm Beach County has done some heat recently for how they treat the rich and famous when they come to the criminal justice system. Now I know Jeffrey Epstein did not have an arrest.
That was 3 administrations ago.
I understand. Do you want to talk about, set the record straight now, how are you handling it? What choices are you going to be making to send it to investigators?
Yes, well, Florida voters passed into our Constitution something called Marcy's Law, which is the Victim's Bill of Rights. So we have already had a training session for all our prosecutors, and we are adhering to Marcy's Law. And as someone who campaigned for Marcy's Law, it's really important to all of us. We must let the victims' voices be heard.
Dave,
Yes.
if Mr. Kraft were found guilty and has to put that mandatory program, that's just $400.
Correct. Well, it also depends on the court. It depends on the judge and the court whether they make an arrangement. But that would be largely out of our hands. The judge imposes the sentence. Now, if there's a plea, then we have a lot more to say in it. But this is all speculation at this point. It's still early.
And someone just asked me, this man might get some referred to, but the health department gave this place a clean bill of health. Do you understand how that might have happened? Were they just checking for whether the counters were clean or looking for something?
You know, at Al Johnson, I work on Sober Homes Task Force, and when it came to drug treatment centers, we were often frustrated that the inspections that occurred were just to see if the fire extinguishers were working. So we upgraded the laws to help increase the inspections and the demands for and maybe that's something that needs to be done here, too. Maybe there should be increased scrutiny.
Well, I mean, when TSA workers are told to look for human trafficking victims, it seems like a government worker inside, working for the state and county might have it.
Yeah, you know, there are 328 million Americans, and there are about 800,000 law enforcement officers. So it's up to all of us to be the eyes and ears to protect against human trafficking, because a lot of this stuff occurs in plain sight. You know, it's like the nail salon worker who is living in the back room and who's not allowed to handle money and is afraid to look at you in the eye. If you see something, say something, and maybe that's the good that can come out of all this. Maybe we'll have a new understanding of what human trafficking is and what it isn't.
We can have last questions, please.
Well, it meant that there were two different occurrences in which he's being charged. It's just what it is, that instead of one charge, there are two counts, and so he faces two separate counts and have to satisfy those counts with a plea and move on from there. It could. I'll take one more. All right. Hey, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we've been listening to Dave Ehrenberg, the state attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida. He says that his office is charging 25 people for soliciting prostitution. He says that is a first-degree misdemeanor, which is punishable by up to 1 year in jail. Patriots owner Robert Kraft is facing 2 charges. He is among the 25 people charged during a sweep made as part of a human trafficking investigation into a Jupiter, Florida spa. Ehrenberg said Kraft's attorney has already been provided with his summons, and he promised that everyone charged in this case will be treated equally, regardless of resources.